Cells that save. On August 1st, 1920, in the small town of Roanoke, Virginia, a girl was born that would change medical research and help cure diseases that would stop millions from dying. Who is this woman, you ask? Loretta Pleasant. Although her name was changed to Henrietta for an unknown reason, young Henrietta moved to Clover, Virginia to live with her grandfather after her mother died and her father needed help taking care of her and her siblings. Henrietta grew up working on a tobacco farm. At her grandfather's house, she shared a bedroom with her cousin David, also known as Day Lax, who she would later marry. At the age of 14, Henrietta gave birth to Lawrence Lax, and 4 years later, Elsie Lax. Elsie Lax was born with developmental disabilities, which people at the time didn't understand. Elsie was later sent to a hospital for the Negro insane called Crownsville Hospital Center. David, her husband now, wanted to work for a steel corporation, so they all moved to Maryland. Once in Maryland, Henrietta and David had 3 more children. David, also known as Sonny Lax, Deborah Lax, and Joseph Lax. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital without telling anyone that she thought something was seriously wrong, the only hospital that treated black patients. Black patients were treated much later in the disease process. They were often not given the same kind of pain management that white patients would have gotten, and they died more often of disease. Quote from Rebecca Skloot. African Americans were not treated as well as whites were, so it was possible that Henrietta would have lived longer than she had and maybe would have gotten recognition for her cells. At this time, the civil rights movement started and was fighting for equal rights for African Americans. This led to the known heroes like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and many others that fought for equal rights. Her cells represent a time where African Americans were not treated equally. Her cells add to the anger of the racial discrimination that took place in the medical field. After having her last born, Joseph, she had a major hemorrhage and was sent back to Johns Hopkins. The doctor took a biopsy of her cervix for testing. It turned out she had adenocarcinoma, which is a cancerous tumor. For treatment, she had radium tube inserts. She was sent back home, hoping the treatment would work. But at 31 years old, she went back to the hospital and after having a partial autopsy, was told that the cancer had spread throughout her whole body. Henrietta died on October 4th, 1951. However, her cells that were taken from her body stayed alive. This was a miraculous moment in medical history. Scientists were able to multiply her cells and test vaccinations on her living cells. Her cancer cells are the source of the HeLa cell line, the first immortalized cell line and one of the most important cell lines in medical research. Her cells were the only ones that would divide multiple times without dying, which is why they became known as immortal. The source of her cells came from the tumor that was biopsied. When she was still alive, her cells were taken at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in hopes of finding cells that would stay alive long enough to last multiple experiments. Cells that were taken from other people wouldn't survive for multiple testings, which, without multiple testings, would not make it safe enough for the public. Her cells were microbial cultured by George Otto Guy, who created HeLa for all of the patients he took cells from. He combined the first 2 letters of the first and last name. Johns Hopkins Hospital taking her cells without her consent was very unethical and is now prohibited. Doctors cannot take tissue or cells from patients without their consent. Henrietta nor her family were compensated for the use of her cells. Her cells inspired other people to fight for patient confidentiality rights. Since the 1950s, scientists have grown 20 tons of her cells, and there are almost 11,000 patents involving HeLa cells. In the early 1970s, HeLa cells started to contaminate and take over other cell cultures. As a result, members of Henrietta's family received solicitations for blood samples from researchers hoping to learn about the family's genetics. Her family, however, was not aware of the reason for the request of the blood samples. Information about her mother's cells were not told to her family. Deborah finally found out about her mother's cells from her sister-in-law, Babette Lax, who found out from her friend who had been growing HeLa cells in his lab. Babette told Deborah and the rest of her family about the immortal cells and that her cells were being used all over the world. After Deborah found out that her mother's cells were still alive and being used, she tried to find out everything about her mother that she could. Her mother's cells and how they were taken caused Deborah lots of stress and caused her to be paranoid and many other health issues. She avoided much of the press for a very long time because they still weren't getting the money from the distributors of the cells. Rebecca Skloot, the author of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, was very persistent on talking to the Lacks family and trying to bring recognition to Henrietta and her cells. She managed to become very good friends with Deborah, which helped Deborah figure out the story behind Henrietta and helped gain recognition from Johns Hopkins and other establishments. Her cells were distributed to other research labs for testing. They were being sent all over for all sorts of doctors to test on them. Researchers published the DNA sequence of the genome of a strand of HeLa cells, and family medical records were published without family consent. At the time, permission was neither required nor customarily sought about tissue or cells. The biggest concern was privacy. What information was actually going to be out there about our grandmother, and what information they can obtain from her sequencing that would tell them about her child and grandchildren and going down the line. Jerry Lax, a grandchild of Henrietta Lacks, said, "The HeLa cells have helped so many people from getting diseases. Have you ever had a polio vaccine or a smallpox vaccine? If so, Henrietta's cells made that possible. HeLa cells have also vaccinated certain strands of cancer and HPV. Research on HIV and AIDS and Parkinson's have been experimented on using HeLa as well. In fact, HeLa cells are still in use. Experiments are still being conducted on them. People all over the world have been helped by Henrietta's cells. They were used to create many vaccines and were able to help with many research projects to help cure diseases like cancer. Millions of people were saved from Henrietta's cells, and they helped further scientific discoveries. That is why she needs to be more recognized. She is an unsung hero."